Cool. We're talking about tool stack discipline or something like that today. I'm Jordan. I like talking about this kind of stuff. I don't really like presenting so much, so let's converse. I make a deck because I don't think I'm allowed to just come up and hang out with people. They make me like submit things and talk about things on the screen. I'm director of managed services for a company called Mirazon. We're a managed service provider that are about 5 minutes from here or so, I think is where our office is. Been doing infosec stuff for a while. Lots of letters next to my name because I like studying neat stuff like breaking into RFID and any other infosec-y kind of thing. I'm also a giant tool nerd, so I love finding new security tools. And this presentation is a lessons learned through years of liking tools a whole bunch and probably not being so disciplined with them, and how to save yourself some headaches, I guess. But yeah, interrupt at any time. I don't care. I think the deck will be available for free somewhere. If it's not, just hit me up on LinkedIn and I'll give it to you if we don't get to the end of it. But it should be a conversation. That way your time's not wasted here. Agenda. How many of you use some kind of security tool in your roles? How many of you use more than 5? More than 10? You're the reason we have this presentation. More than 20? I'm an MSP. We have like 35 tools last I counted. It's insanity. Yeah, keep thinking. You're like, I use 5 tools. Wait, my spam filter, then I have this other thing, and I have my vuln scanner, 4 EDRs. Shit, I got a SIM that time. Like, then that second SIM because the first one wasn't working, and I forgot to turn off the first one. Like, I get it. I'm a security engineer. So we're going to talk about why this is a nightmare. We're going to talk about like how we ended up in this spot. And we're going to talk about how do we get out of this kind of mess, because managing a lot of tools is expensive and exhausting for the people who have to do it and everybody else around them, even the people who really, really, really like the tools like me. So how did we get here? Depending on when you got into IT, if it was like a decade ago, you were probably in one of those eras where they're like, security is about being like a castle. You put everything in one place and you surround it with walls and you put layers on that, and everything is easy because it's all in a building. And we're like, that's cool. Put up a firewall, patch your stuff, passwords, yada, yada. Things are safe. And then the world's like, I don't like going to the office. And then a disease came along and it's like, now you can't go to the office. So that means data had to go everywhere. When that happened, we had to protect a lot more things. And that meant all the traditional methodology that we were taught for a decade stopped working. When we shoved all of our data up into a cloud, we had to manage cloud security. When we shoved it onto mobile devices like laptops, we had to figure out how to secure those. When people started traveling out of the country, we had to figure out how to track that and determine what out of countries were okay and which weren't. When people decided that marketing really liked Box.com and not OneDrive, we had to figure out how to manage both, because otherwise they would do it anyway. Right? Like, it didn't matter. I think one of the earlier talks from Optiv was spot on. It's talking about how all this stuff changes and the business is going to do what it's going to do no matter what. And security's job is to help them successfully do it securely. But the minute you stop or trying to stop them from doing it, you're going to fail at your job, because they're just going to not tell you and do it anyway. And then security gets a lot harder. So all of our jobs got really, really complicated because we started distributing more. We put our data in lots of other places. Attack surfaces got bigger, data got sprawled out. And every business is now more technology dependent than they ever have been, which means everything has to be secured at some point. If you can tell me a business that does not rely on a computer today, I will be shocked, because we were talking about it with my marketing director yesterday. What is our target customer profile as an MSP? And it's like literally everyone. Everybody has computers. So yay for us. Sad day for everybody who has to secure them, also us. So while we were making life much harder for ourselves, a bunch of attackers came along and said, shit, this is a great way to make some money. And they also evolved, right? Attackers went from, these really smart hackers going after big businesses. They made movies about these guys. It's cool. And then they found out that if they just steal your data, they can ask you for money. And then they found out that they didn't actually have to steal it. They just had to encrypt it where it was, and that's easier. And then you will give them the money, because you also aren't very good at backups, because more tools. And then the world got really complicated, and we realized now governments are backing hackers. And we would think that those attackers wouldn't care about us because they're busy hacking other governments, and we're wrong. It turns out that when global conflicts like the Ukrainian-Russian war come out, these groups that are backed by governments say, hey, if you're a private business and you're supporting a government I don't like, I'm going to attack you. I'm going to steal your stuff. I'm going to make your life miserable. So all of a sudden, we were dealing with organizations that are doing our jobs, but on the opposite side of morality, right? Like they're being paid to run a business to make our lives hard, just like we're being paid to stop them. And that's highly inconvenient because we're all being motivated by the same thing, which is a profit motive for a business. Ransomware as a service came along, and they're incredibly profitable. I think I did a review of Conti at some point last year, and they were up to like 127 million in revenue. Like that's wild. That's bigger than the vast majority of businesses that exist in the US, right? Like, and they're just a ransomware as a service group. They're waking up just to screw with us and make money. And then if we get good at it, they're like, nah, it's okay. I can find another way to do this. Or I'm going to email Jim in accounting with this cool cat meme, and he's going to click on it because cats are cool. And you guys have to figure out how to stop Jim from doing that shit. Like meanwhile, you're also clicking on the cat meme because cats are awesome, right? So we're like fighting human nature to figure out how to defend this environment against a actual adversary versus just broken Dell stuff that we were used to defending against, and Microsoft releasing crappy patches. Like we knew how to deal with that. This guy wants money and can use cat memes against us. We're in a bad place. So then the government steps in because it's what they do, and they said, hey, you guys aren't doing a good enough job, so we're going to make some rules for you. How many of you work for a business that is required to follow some level of compliance or regulation? Your jobs suck a little more because of that, right? You have to actually do it, and then an auditor will come along and tell you didn't, and then you have to explain to the auditor how it is actually being done. How many of you are auditors before I go on with this? Okay, cool. You know that auditors are kind of rough to deal with. But regulations come in and things get less fun, but they get a lot harder, but they're needed, right? Like a lot of these rules came along because organizations didn't do this well, and people were getting hurt as a result. Made our jobs harder, but here we are. We have to deal with it. And it's a mess. So why is this all a problem, right? Like tools are neat. I can go downstairs. There's at least 20 people out there that'll sell me a tool that tells me all my problems will be solved if I just buy theirs. Meanwhile, the person next to them will say the same thing. There's at least 1,000 more out in the wild. Like if I go throw a rock, I promise I can get an invite to a steak dinner by a security vendor somewhere. Like they're just there ready. I like their marketing budgets. I like steak. It works. But I think Bill Gates said it right. He said the first rule of technology used in the business is that automation applied to efficient operations will magnify the efficiency. Second rule is automation applied to an inefficient operation will magnify inefficiency. And ultimately, every tool we buy is a form of automation, right? We buy EDRs because we can't sit at every desktop and review every action and every process. So we have a tool to automate that for us. We buy a SIM because we can't get to every firewall in a timely manner and look at every log in real time. We're about efficiency and we're about automation, and tools give that to us. But often the process that it's underlying doesn't work. We're fundamentally in the wrong spot, so we apply gasoline to an out of control fire and we burn the shit out of ourselves over and over. And these vendors are here to help you do that. Right? Like every day there is 100 emails in my mailbox saying, hey, buy this new tool. And it's nothing against these vendors. They're just the ones that had logos that fit on my slide. Like there's hundreds of them and new ones come out every day. Like how many of you have gotten a piece of email that said, buy this new tool sometime in the last week? Easily, right? Like today, because we signed up for the conference. Like there's going to be a lot of them. And when you get back tomorrow, there's going to be 13 because your information got submitted to them when we bought tickets. Mine too. It's cool. At least Optiv is auctioning off whiskey with it. So I'm fine. But a problem occurs when we have all these vendors and they're telling us over and over that their tool will change our day, it'll make our life easier. They're advertising to our bosses who don't understand why that may or may not work. They're advertising to everybody in our organization. I think I knew we were in for a bad time when CrowdStrike bought a Super Bowl ad, right? And like once they're this mainstream, they're going after the masses. It's not just talking to technical people. We have another challenge on our hands, and it's now we have to explain why that tool just won't fix the problem, how it doesn't fit into the environment, why it's not just that easy. I do have to send people to training. And then tools became like this default answer for everybody. It was, hey, we have this security issue, no problem, buy some tools. There's a whole bunch of vendors, they'll sell them to you. And it's like, well, the implementation project to get those tools rolled out sucked. It's going really bad, we're not on track. They're like, no problem, project management tool, let's go. And then we're like, well, we have all these tools and they're too noisy. They're like, not a problem. Buy that MDR tool. Take care of all those alerts real quick. And then it's like, wait, the people running the MDR aren't doing good. They're like, I have a personality assessment for that. Buy that tool. Will make you good at hiring also, so they can manage your tools good. And then we're like, there's too many tools. I can't keep track of all this. They're like, password manager tool. Got you, guy. Right? Like there's just tools on tools on tools, and the problem just gets bigger and bigger and complicated and horrible. For the people who have to manage it, it causes this fatigue and this burnout. How many of you guys get alerts that are redundant at some point during your day? Yeah, it kind of sucks. Like 10 minutes ago, somebody's like, hey, who can look at this alert from, I think it was from 40, I don't know, something. And it's like, well, everybody on our team should probably be able to look at that. But I bet we also got one from 365 because it was about phishing. Like, we have multiple tools looking at the same thing, and we're going to send texts after these things, and some know how to use one tool and some know how to use another. Hopefully they know it's the same alert. And we come up in this situation where we're trying to train people on how to read alerts from 10 different platforms, how to combine them to understand what's actually happening. I mean, and I don't think any of us have the time or training budget to be infinitely good at this stuff. So our teams, in like this effort to be really good at what we're doing, we've implemented really good technology, end up in a worse position because we're exhausted. Our phones are blowing up, so we create that Outlook rule, right? The good intentioned alert that we thought was going to come in to help us is now an annoyance, and it gets auto-deleted or filed, right? Like, or we spend our time looking at it going, I have no idea what this is trying to tell me. I don't know what the IPS code that this random vendor came up with means, and I don't know how to troubleshoot it. So, oh, it says it's only medium urgency, so I guess that's not today's problem, right? And then when it's an urgent issue, like, I still don't know how to read this, so now we're in trouble. We lose attention to detail because we don't have time. If we're going through 5,000 alerts a day, you're just not going to have the energy to pay attention to all of them. And often they just conflict. How many of you have a patch management tool? How many times has that annoyed your EDR? Yeah. How many of you have like a privilege access management tool? How many times has that broken your patch management tool? Right? Like, we just stack these layers because we know we need a PAM. We need that. People can't have local admins, but they want printers, and I hate printers, so I'm going to give them admin access so I don't have to work on their printer. To do that, I need a PAM. That PAM is going to stop my update thing from working properly. That's going to set off an alert, and the machine's not going to be patched, and now I'm going to get it infected because my two tools didn't work that I was trying to use to stop them from getting infected. So you run into this conflict, and it's horrible. And then you're less secure, and you've spent a bunch of money, and you're tired, and you hate your job, and you get burned out. How many of you are actually security engineers full time? Like, that's your job. How many are like sysadmins? Any developers? All of it? Yeah. How many of you are just like the guy in your company who has to deal with technology because if it breaks, they're going to call you and you like getting paid? Yeah, it's all of us. Yeah, right. So like, it sucks. So we spent a bunch of money. We had a bunch of arguments because no one wanted us to spend the money. And then the thing's broken. They're like, why didn't you spend the money? And it's just a mess and you're tired. So how do we get out of here? So that's the important part, right? It's an option. I was talking to one of my coworkers, and she lives in Florida. And I was like, hey, and she left for Houston before the hurricane came. And I was like, hey, how you doing? She's like, man, it's a bad day. I was like, but at least you're not in Florida where the hurricane is. She's like, eh. I was like, no, I feel you. Like, yeah, it's a good call. Maybe the hurricane would have been a better day, right? Like, maybe. I don't know. Like, rough day. I know how to fix the house. I don't know how to fix this. Like, no. But really, it's about just not being distracted by this kind of stuff, right? Like, every day we look at new tools because we're trying to solve problems. Tools seem like an easy fix, but the goal is to understand what problems are, not be distracted by shiny stuff that vendors are waving in front of you, and understanding that effective management of tools is more important almost than how technically sound the tools are. Like, Gartner exists to tell us that there's like 10 options in these upper quadrants that they call out every year because vendors pay them. But they're not wrong. Like, the difference between, like, who uses CrowdStrike as an example? Cool. Who uses Trend? Defender? What other EDRs are you guys using? Sentinel-1? Yeah, okay. Huh? Cortex? Okay, well, other than Cortex, the others are usually pretty good. No, I'm kidding. Cortex is fine too. Palo Alto's here somewhere, sorry. My bad. No, but really, like, all these tools are mostly the same. Like, they're all good. They all go after the MITRE stuff, and MITRE comes back and says, yep, they all got like 99 out of 100 on our thing. And they're not lying. They're all good tools. They're competent companies hiring intelligent people in a field that's fairly mature. We pick the ones we like. When something bad happens, we pick an alternative. When a new CFO comes in, we pick something cheaper to make them happy. But ultimately, we're just bouncing between like the top 5. What differentiates all of our ability here is the ability to manage these tools effectively. And what ends up happening is every time you shift that, you reduce your ability to manage and your familiarity with the tool. So that shift gives you a net negative towards your security posture. And a lot of organizations don't understand that because they're focused on that, well, I can save $1.25 an agent. This one got slightly higher on MITRE. I was at a peer group meeting and they told me CrowdStrike was awesome. The following week, I got stuck in an airport and that was CrowdStrike's fault. So now I'm moving to SentinelOne, even though a year ago they did the same thing and both were Microsoft's fault. Like, this conversation happens every day and we keep jumping between tools and hope that the next one fixes the problem. But it's not true, even if they say they have AI. I think last year I went to a conference and I was like, cool, there's new vendors here. And I was like, oh, same vendor, they just added AI to their tool, so they rebranded themselves, so they're cool. How many of you use AI daily in your business? Meaningfully. Like, how many of you have a security tool that actually leverages AI effectively? Right, that's how almost all of them are, but how many of them have AI listed as a banner feature currently of their tool? They're like, we have machine learning like you have never seen. Right, like, and it's like, I still have the same shitty log. Like, you still don't detect the things I want, and I still have a lot of false positives. So not every new tool is better. Not every new flagship offering with AI is somehow better, because unless you improve your ability to monitor, your team's ability to respond, you're not more secure. If you can't manage the tool effectively within an environment, it's not meaningfully useful, right? Like, I can spend a lot of money on tools, and unless they're deployed 100% effectively and monitored and maintained, useless, right? There's no shortcuts on this stuff. So mostly we just have to stop trying to look for shortcuts. The last presentation I was in a couple back talked about silver bullets. There are none. He was right. If there were, they'd be a lot more expensive and we'd all already own them, right? So we have to understand that this is about effective utilization of tools, understanding problems, and ultimately it's about reducing risk for our organizations. That's our job. Like, how many of you come in every day and say, my job is to reduce risk for my company? It's not enough of you, right? Like, a lot of us come in, and I'm guilty of this every day. It's, my job is to make sure these servers are online and there's no bad guys stealing my data. It's like, that is kind of the job. That's the tactical part of the job. But the realization is that the only reason we care about that is because if a bad guy stole the data, it's expensive. Business can't perform if they're burning cash, giving it to ransomware gangs, right? It's because if our customers know that we aren't protecting their data and something gets stolen, they're not going to be our customers anymore, probably, unless you're Equifax, right? Like, no, I'm not Equifax. I don't get to burn everybody's data and still be awesome. Like, we're not that lucky. So our job every day when we walk in is risk reduction. To do that, we have to be intentional. I think this is where we go off the mark a little bit, right? We see a problem and we try to solve it without fully understanding it. And then we end up with this pile of tools that we think we use, and then all this overlap starts happening. And then you're like, I don't think we need that anymore, but I'm also not really willing to say no, because what if something bad happens? It's like, my EDR does DNS filtering, firewall does DNS filtering, so could I stop using one of those licenses? And you're like, yeah, but what if we get hacked and the DNS thing didn't work? I don't want to be the guy who made that decision, so I'm just going to let it roll. And your life sucks a little more because now you have to manage 2 tools. Your budget's a little smaller because you're paying for 2 tools. It's because we're not trying to reduce risk. We're trying to cover our asses sometimes. It's just the position we're in.
But you're saying, like, it's going to, the budget's smaller, but it's going to get taken away if we lose it. Like, if you stop using one of those tools, they just take the budget.
I mean, at least you're doing less work. Right? Like, if, like, using money for the sake of using money, I'm all for that. Like, if I could just have Palo Alto sell me whiskey, accounting doesn't know any difference. So, take that back. Like, like, diversify that portfolio some. But I mean, the reality is, like, if the budget's going away, but it's not being spent meaningfully anyway, who cares? I'd rather spend less money. Maybe they'll pay me more. I know, it's funny. I'm good at jokes. But no, like, but that's the reality, right? Like, ultimately, if we're looking at our stack and we're saying, hey, if I don't spend this money, the money is going to get taken away. I guess that's fair, but if that money is ultimately making my job harder because I have to manage this stuff and ultimately causing more conflicts, like, that doesn't help me. I'd rather spend less money. So I think that's the way to kind of look at it. And look at consolidating when it makes sense. I'm not saying, hey, go all in with Microsoft and buy only Microsoft Defender for whatever they branded it this year. I'm saying if there's tools that do the same things that you need well, and you can manage those things well, consolidating makes your life easier, makes your finance department's life easier, it makes everybody's life kind of easier. There's some risk with that, so don't just shove everything in one basket, but understand that being intentional about tool selection is super, super meaningful and helpful. Make sense? Got to be self-aware. How many of you have bought tools and you're like, man, I'm going to be a badass forensics guy, and then looked at Velociraptor and like, shit, I'm not a badass forensics guy? Because I did that once. I have a cert in it, and it was the hardest cert I ever took from SANS, and I was like, I'm not a forensics guy. This is terrible. Like, being self-aware about this stuff, I think, is incredibly important. I think we're all very well-intentioned. I think we are all thinking on a good day when we make that decision that we'll have the time to look at these logs to say, you know what, I will definitely be able to do access control better if I read what rights everybody have. It's like, I'm going to go learn how to use Bloodhound to make sure there's no domain admin sitting on my network, and then you never run it again because you just don't have the time, or your team doesn't have the maturity, or even if you had that information, you don't know how to go and facilitate the change throughout your organization. I think being self-aware is okay there. Figuring out if you're building it, buying it, or partnering to do it. I think that's a decision all of these organizations need to make, including my own, right? We don't build everything. We definitely partner with people that do things we're not good at. I think that's a philosophical discussion that has to happen inside of an organization. There's vendors out there that refuse to partner. I don't really like vendors like that a lot of the time, because you either end up with, when they take that position, you know their tools aren't going to integrate well with a lot of other things you want to use. As an organization, you have to kind of think the same thing. Like, building stuff is cool. Maintaining stuff you built usually isn't. So figure out what's right for you as an organization. Like, you're going to build your SIM. I worked for a company once who decided to build their own SIM. And I was like, why are we building our own SIM? And it's because the guy in charge of the InfoSec department was a developer. And he's like, I can build a better SIM than anything that's on the market, and it'll be free. Like, we pay you, right? Like, pay him a lot. So yeah, building your own isn't free, just in case anybody wasn't aware. But understanding like what your current situation is, what your team's ability to actually utilize tools is, what your organization's maturity level is to manage that data and actually do something useful with it, all come into play. And how many of you are in charge of like fully budgeting for this stuff for your companies, where you have to just like roll out the budget, say what you're going to spend it on, do all that? How many of you budget for training to go along with every tool you buy? How many of you have a training budget that you know exists? It's a very small number. Yeah, that's usually a problem, right? Like, the tool is the start. Learning to use the tool, having the time to effectively implement the tool, learning how to respond to the things the tool says, learning how to get support for the tool. Training becomes an almost more expensive portion of the purchase, and implementation and management of the tool becomes way higher cost than the license pretty much ever will be. So being aware of your ability to do all that in addition to buying the tool becomes really important. And then you have to calculate that against the risk. Oh, go ahead. Turnkey, 100%, no problem ever. They don't even need to do a test deploy. Just hit the install button. At a week tops. Yeah.
Click, install,
Done. Steak dinner Friday night, you're fine. Like, they get their commission check, it's fine. Like, yeah. From their perspective, it is in fact done, right? Like, the invoice got paid. So no, it's not. None. What could possibly go wrong with blindly installing a set of security tools in an environment? I like SOAR products that say they'll take care of all that stuff for you. They're like, brand new to the environment, trust me to deactivate accounts when bad things happen. It's fine. Like, it's nothing wrong here. No, but that's the reality of this stuff. Is it rapidly goes from, this seems very simple and worked in my test environment, to, I didn't know Nancy in accounting traveled to like Indonesia every third month. Like, that's odd. Like, the visibility comes up real quick, and then things are broken, and you're like, oh crap, I didn't really plan to be spending this much time on implementation. I have this other project because it's not just my full-time job to implement security tools. Kind of sucks. And then we have to actually figure out if this was worth it. How many of you have a clear picture of what like the financial risk to your organization is if there were a breach? Do you? It's hard to figure out. Like there's a lot of like variables, and I would like if you go, who has your CISSP? Like, cool. Remember in the book where they gave you that easy, simple like formula to be like, this is what risk looks like to you. Like, and then you went to work, you're like, wait a minute. They're like, downtime costs you this much. I'm like, no, I have to work on Saturday if I didn't get to work on Friday. Like the work got done. It just sucked for me. Like that's how life actually works, right? The downtime happens and there are penalties, but it's not so cut and dry. So understanding what the actual risk is, communicating it internally, getting everybody to buy into that. Sometimes it's easy. Like if you're a manufacturing facility, you can be like, yep, I make 80 widgets an hour, down for 10 hours, can't make 800 widgets. That sucks. I sell all the widgets I make, so easy math. If you're a law firm, it's like, that's a little harder. I guess if the deadline we missed was, we were supposed to be in court and now my, client's in jail, rough. If you're a tax attorney and it's like December 8th and things break, you're like, I don't care. April 14th, really bad day. It's variable. So you have to understand like how does risk work, and it's not just financials. It's if somebody knows, will they actually care? Will they leave me as a customer if my name shows up in a newspaper? What does that cost? I helped a client with an incident response a while back, and that was sort of the situation they were in. Big, well-known company in another state where I'm originally from. They got compromised. Data was exfiltrated, and it was an extortion thing. They're like, hey, pay us or we're just going to publish all your employee data. They're like, you don't have my employees' data. And they're like, no, we do. Here it is. And we're like, oh, shit, they do have our employees' data. Like, that's a bad day. And they had to make the decision of paying for it and hoping they didn't release the data, or not pay for it and certainly be in a newspaper because they were a major local company. They made the decision to not pay. They definitely ended up in a newspaper, and people in the news dog piled on it. They're like, look at this, another cybersecurity attack. Look, all this data at risk. And it's like, no, it was their employees' data. It wasn't customer data, but nobody in the news will designate any of that stuff. They're just going to say you got hacked. So you have to understand, like, what does this do to your reputation? They were big enough where it doubt it hurt them, right? There weren't that many options opposed to them. People just, are going to keep doing business with them. It's okay. Most smaller businesses don't have that luxury, right? We're not Equifax. Like we have to keep doing good in order to continue to exist. There's legal ramifications. You all talked about compliance. How many of you know how much you're on the hook for if you are in violation of your compliance? Got one back there. It's a lot. I had a tool once that used to look at the average insurance payout for every record violation. So we'd run these scans across the network, and it's like, probably shouldn't have found 500 social security numbers, but I did. And it turns out the average payout's like $13 a pop. So do you have this much insurance? Because you'll need it. Right? Like, and that's the kind of stuff that we have to think through. It's like, yeah, there's financial damage from losing productivity, but there's financial damage on fines. There's the inability to continue doing business. There's ongoing costs. I had to work with a hotel chain that once got compromised because a vendor reset an admin password back to a default and it was publicly exposed and a bunch of stuff. Turns out PCI is cool if that happens once. The third time it happens, far less cool. Same vendor, they're not the ones who get punished. It's actually the hotel, right? So working with those kinds of organizations, their IT costs, if you're familiar with PCI, you're raised to a higher level of compliance at that point. It means their ongoing IT cost was increased by millions per year after that because they now had to be secured and audited to a level they didn't have to previously because they were irresponsible. That is crazy because all of a sudden they thought they were okay and they existed for decades at a certain level and they thought things were good. Wrong vendor choice, didn't fix it, bad testing methodology, didn't fix it the second time, compromised the third, and all of a sudden any upgrades they were looking to do for the next few years, unless specifically security focused, gone because they were paying millions to get everything else sorted. Zero went to jail. But that's the reality of being in business sometimes, right? Is like all of a sudden these costs that we didn't really think about when we were writing our budgets, right? We wrote a budget for a tool cost. We wrote a budget for maybe some training if we're really good at our jobs and our businesses support that kind of stuff. We probably didn't think about, if I don't do this next year, my IT budget's going to have to actually be triple because I have to do all this extra stuff. I didn't budget for the $25,000 a year annual pen test that I now have to do. I didn't budget for the SIM that I didn't really need before, but now absolutely have to have. Otherwise, I can't use Visa. Like, it quickly gets very expensive. So you have to kind of be understanding what the potential risk is, because ultimately, if your solutions cost more than the risk, you shouldn't be doing them. And if you ever want to get them approved from a budget perspective, you have to prove that they'll actually defer some of that risk or reduce it. And by how much, if you really want to get good at this. So understanding risk becomes critical to our jobs. And I am a technician. I am not a CFO. So this was all news to me coming up, kind of doing this stuff. How many of you have ever taken classes on how to calculate risk? Yeah, I didn't. Like, most of us, I think, come up as engineers. We learn how to fix computers and defend things. We don't really think about, the financial repercussions of a business being out of business for 4 days. And then figuring out how difficult that is actually to figure out. And a lot of businesses don't have CFOs mature enough to make those decisions if you're in smaller places, right? Like, they're just like, I don't know, that's fine. And that's why most of them don't have EDRs, right? They don't understand this stuff either. So you're kind of in a rough spot. And then say you get through all that, you kind of have to figure out now, where's the best place to protect us? Where is the threat actually vulnerable? Like, where's the vulnerability? Is it an endpoint thing that you're trying to fix? Is it a network thing? Is it a web app that you had a developer build 8 years ago because nothing out of the box was in your budget, and now you have to figure out how to maintain and protect that? Is it that old AS400 in your basement because you're a manufacturer and rebuilding it will cost millions and you don't want to? Like, where is the risk and how do you even defend against that? Cool tools like MITRE exist now to help with some of that stuff, so that's neat. But understanding where to even implement controls becomes a challenge in its own right. How many of you are familiar with the MITRE attack framework? Cool, most. That's good. If you're not, go check it out. MITRE attack framework gives you an outline of common threats found, tactics, techniques, and procedures used by advanced persistent threats. Lots of big words, just means how bad guys are getting into your environments and doing bad things. They monitor a lot of active, all of the ones on the list are things they've seen in the real world by real attackers. They're not theoretical vulnerabilities that haven't been exploited. It's, we saw bad guys do this repeatedly. It worked. Here's how you stop it, or at least know it's happening. Here's why they're doing it. Super good tool. Look it up. And then you have to figure out, do I already have something in place that's supposed to be doing this? Because I thought I bought a tool last year that was supposed to do this for me and it's still not doing it. And you have to figure out, is this new tool in addition to the old tool, or is the old tool going away? And then you have to figure out if you're still in contract, because that steak dinner was good and you signed a 3-year deal to get 10% off, right? Like, you have to figure all these things out. And this gets difficult in itself, right? We have to figure out, how do we now implement the new tool in an environment that makes sense meaningfully? And how do we make it useful? We deployed the EDR, how do we respond to it? How do we make sure our team knows how to read the logs? We deployed the firewall, how do we manage it? How do we manage changes? How do we track the changes? How do we get approval to open 3389 to the world because somebody in accounting needs remote access right now? We don't do that. The answer is we don't do that. But all these things kind of come into play, and again, the job just gets a little harder. And ultimately, as a business, you have to implement a process to do this stuff. How many of you have a formal documented process for adding new tools to your environment? Why don't the rest of you? Like, that's a real question. Like, how come there isn't a formal way to do this in your business? Do other parts of your business have one? Yeah. I mean, for me, it was because I didn't think I needed it. Like, I thought, hey, there's a problem. I can fix the problem. Not a dumb person. I know how to evaluate tools, whatever. Like, I'll try 3 or 4. I'll pick the one I like, then I'll get the second one because it's cheaper. But really having a real mature process around defining the needs that you have, figuring out what the available solutions in the world are, evaluating the both technical and non-technical aspects of it. And that's a big one. Like, a lot of people pick really good tools that are really hard to buy. As a managed service provider, we get into this a lot where we find a vendor that's excellent and they have a great tool and we're like, this is technically outstanding, and their terms suck and they don't fall into our billing model for our customers, so I can't buy it. Or they're just really difficult to work with from a support perspective. So when the tool is working, it's great. When it's not, it's terrible. And we have to figure out, well, how often will I need support? and how critical is the tool if I don't get support. There's a lot of DR vendors who fall into that category where their tool is really, really, really good most of the time. And then that one time you really, really need them, they don't answer the phone. It's a bad day. Security tools aren't that different. You have to have a plan for implementing your solution, and then you have to have a plan to figure out if it actually worked. How many of you have a plan to figure out if your tool is doing what you meant it to do after you install it? Good, some. That's another one where it's like, hey, I bought an EDR because CrowdStrike blue screened all my stuff, so I moved to SentinelOne. Am I more or less protected today? Like, how do you measure that? Right? But that's important. Or, hey, I want to invest more in endpoint security tools because we're still getting malware on these devices. Or I want to invest more in security awareness training because KnowBe4 got boring and our staff aren't reading it anymore. Like, how do you evaluate if the investment was worthwhile and if you should keep doing it? Or do you just keep doing it because your budget's going to get taken away if you don't, right? Like, you have to have a way to measure ROI. You're still part of the business, and if you can't do that, your budget's probably not going to go up, or you're just going to get told, too bad, you have plenty of money, figure it out. And you need to learn how to make those cuts if they're not working. I like to use frameworks like NIST, CFS to do some of this. How many of you map your tooling out to your compliance frameworks? So this is cool if you're looking at how to map out where your risk is, what your requirements are, where you have duplicate, where you have room to fix and grow. I think things like this are super meaningful ways to understand your environment and how to fix it. MITRE has a cool heat map tool that you can use to do this too if you like MITRE. I like MITRE. But CSF is much, I think, simpler. It's more executive friendly, who's not super technical. So you can kind of just go through and say, okay, well, what are the parts of our business that we have data, right? We talked about all that sprawl. So there's cloud stuff, there's network stuff, there's endpoint stuff. I like calling stuff on the edge, firewalls, email spam filters, all that kind of stuff that's stopping stuff from getting in your traditional firewall like placement. But there's all kinds of ways to do that now. And then there's the other. There's pen testing, there's vuln scanning, there's all this other stuff you can do. Where does it fall into your security strategy as a whole? And where are the gaps? In this one, not a whole lot of capability for responding, right? So maybe the next budget item is some kind of responsiveness. Maybe we don't need 3 things handling endpoint security. Maybe we can consolidate that down to 2 to get room for the response piece. Maybe it's training so our team knows how to respond. Like, you can kind of figure out where your gaps are, where you have duplicate or triplicate. If you're an MSP, are any of you MSPs? Cool. I don't want to teach my competitors stuff. No, I'm kidding. But as an MSP, this gets really useful because managing multiple tools is hard. And we get caught up in this mess where it's like, well, we have clients who have 8 EDRs. Like, how do I deal with that? So our problem is amplified because we just deal with lots of environments unless we're really disciplined. Your problem still exists because you still have to protect all this stuff, and usually you have way fewer people to do it with. So using something like this is helpful. Or if you have a compliance framework, you can kind of just go through and do something like that. How many of you are going after like CMMC or something currently? CMMC? Super fun. How many of you follow PCI or HIPAA, NIST? How many of you have that Excel sheet somewhere on your desktop where you guys have gone through and done a review at one point? Align your tools to it. Like, have you done that? Yeah, I mean, this is super helpful. Like, the organization needs to do it as a whole. Whoever manages your compliance probably does that. If it's you, you're going to be adding a whole lot of other stuff to this, right? It's not just tools, it's people, it's process. But making sure your tools align here makes sense. And from a budget defense perspective, helps you a lot. It's meaningful, and it allows you to say, hey, we can dump this, $8,000 a month, but we're going to be out of compliance on these 3 bullet points. That helps you. Or you can say, hey, we're spending all of our money, we reduced what we can. We want to move from CMC 2 to 3 because there's this really big deal coming, and we want to be part of it. It's going to get us this much money. I need to check these boxes. It's going to cost this much. It gives you a very clear framework to kind of measure yourself against and helps translate that to something that's tangible and accepted from the industry, right? Like, no one in your company is going to say we don't need to be PCI compliant if you're processing credit cards, or somebody might, they shouldn't, but they might. If you're an engineering firm or working in like DoD supply chain, CMMC is the thing. It's coming up. It'll be a requirement on your contracts. That's tied directly to your revenue stream. You have direct ways to manage these kinds of conversations and these needs. But you can also, again, see, hey, I actually have 3 things hitting this checkbox. Do I need all 3? How do I reduce this? And even if you don't get rid of the tool, you can say, hey, maybe I turn off that function of the tool. That way I don't have this overlap or duplicate in alerts or duplicate in management, because even that helps you, right? Like just because tools can do something doesn't mean you should be using that feature if you have another way to do it. Patching is a big one we see here because a lot of new vuln scanning tools have patching methodologies built in for auto remediation. So people are like, yeah, I turn on, my automated patching, I have Intune running, and my vuln scanner will patch. Surely I'll be 100% updated, except if you mix up the approvals, it starts messing things up. Just turn off the feature sometimes. You don't need every feature of every tool to get value out of it. So understanding that is helpful. And then ultimately you want to maximize impact. How many of you have been like, cool, tools deployed, I am done, and moved on to another project? It happens. All of us have done it. Those who didn't raise their hand, you're lying. You just are. It's not your fault. It's just the way the world works. In order for a tool to be fully effective, we kind of talked about it, right? It has to be managed, maintained, monitored, and implemented consistently. That means you have to document it. How many have documentation about all your tools? Yeah, the gasp of documentation. I get it. We don't either. It's just the world. But we need to. We need to get there. How many of your staff have been formally trained on all the tools you use? Again, that's rough, right? Like, it's like, hey, we bought a new tool. Here's their YouTube channel. Here's their KB. You'll figure it out. You're smart people. I hired smart people. That's their problem. Like, it's not how it works. And then we're like, man, why didn't this tier 1 guy know what that alert was and go fix this before we were ransomware? How do you get support when you need it? How do you know what the contract ID is so they'll even talk to you? Who's allowed to submit support cases? Like all this stuff needs to sort of be addressed. I like the term method of action on tools. How many of you tell your team what the method of action of a tool is? Like how it actually functions in your environment to do the thing it does, right? Like that's a weird way to think about it. Like we talk about that term in like medication usually, where it's like, yeah, you take this pill and the way it makes you less inflamed is X, or it makes pain go away via this. Tools are the same thing. It's like this tool protects you by adding an IP address entry to the blacklist of your firewall. That means that if it executes, no traffic inside of the network can get to that IP address. So if all of a sudden things internal to your network can't get outside, that might be your problem, right? Like if people understand the how of a tool and what it's trying to do, they can usually troubleshoot the problem a lot better than, I think CrowdStrike blue screened all of our stuff again. I pick on CrowdStrike. We're a CrowdStrike partner. It's a good tool. It's just funny. I think CrowdStrike's around here somewhere also, so I apologize if you're in this room. But that's real. And then integrating it with your other tools. How many of you make sure how many of you have a ticketing system in your business first? Cool. How many have all your tools integrated into that ticketing system so a ticket gets generated when there's something you need to do? Way fewer hands. Right? Like that's a problem. If something is actionable, there should be a ticket for it. That way it can be tracked and people know where to do their work. That naturally means that if your tool is generating an actionable alarm, it should go to a ticketing system and not rely on Ken on the help desk to add it to the ticketing system, because that's a waste of Ken's time, but also he won't do it. So you make it go automatically. How many of you have tools that can work together, like a vuln management tool that can also consolidate data with your SIM? How many of you build out those integrations for all your tools? It's less, right? Like it takes a lot of time. Sometimes the value of that might be marginal. So you're like, yeah, maybe not. When we're implementing tools like this, you're usually best off maximizing that where you can. That way you're getting more out of the tool. But that's also where most of the value the vendor promised you was. Like we showed up to the thing, the demo, and they're like, look at all this cool stuff, all this automation. And you're like, okay, it's installed, but I didn't configure the firewall integration, so it's not doing source stuff. That looks like a lot of graph API work, and I don't have time for that in 365, so it's not auto-turning off accounts. It's not even collecting logs properly because I missed the checkbox. Like, it gets real messy really quick. And then going through and correcting conflicts and getting rid of false alarms and tuning stuff. Like, how many of you have effectively, or how many of you are effectively monitoring things like false positives or non-actionable alerts and then doing something about that, other than creating an Outlook rule? Right? Like when I ran a team of SIM engineers, that was one of their bonus stats was, hey, like if you want your bonus, you have to keep false alarms and non-actionable alarms under 1%. Because otherwise it gets really easy to say, yep, the false alarm, yep, that always happens. Yep, Becky in accounting always goes to that app, just closes the ticket. Like people get used to just ignoring stuff and closing stuff, right? they don't care anymore because they're expecting it to be wrong. And then they lose trust in the tool, and then they just make a rule because they had to do that 99 times. And then all of a sudden, the one that they did need to look at just kind of got lost, and now you're compromised. So you have to be really diligent about making sure that you're not creating conflicts. And have you guys heard the term like manage to zero? You're managing to zero on errors, right? Like you want things to stand out because holistically, security is about looking for anomalies. Like it's what we do, right? We look for evil in normal. And you can't do that if evil is what we see every single day all the time, because alerts are just garbage. So you have to really bring that way down, get that noise level down so signal level can come up. And then you can actually get useful stuff out of your tools. That all makes sense? Cool, that's it. Questions, thoughts? Yeah. Yep. So I won't say yes broadly. I will say it depends on the tool. I very much believe that you should not turn on live alerting on any tool without a tuning period. And depending on the function of the tool, you should work your way up if you have enough awareness to do that in an educated and real way. So like I deal in the world of like RMM tools. So we're monitoring performance across a lot of devices, patching and things like that. One of the biggest mistakes most managed service providers make, and really anybody who grabs these tools and throws them in their environment is like, we have monitoring, crank that shit up, look at all the information we have. And then they're like, too much information, stop paying attention, I have work to do. So, but to them, it's like, well, I bought the tool, I need the value. So to get value, I have to turn on alerts, otherwise it's useless. When really, if they would have just turned on the uptime alert, they would have immediately got value they can manage. And then if they turned on the one that says, hey, processors are running a little hot, value, but you can manage it. Disk space, value, and you can manage it. You're missing maybe 80% of the capability, but you're getting value out of it actually, so it's still better off. A SIM, you kind of have to do a little bit different, right? You have to just start inundate with logs. This stuff's useless, turn it off. This stuff's useless, turn it off. This stuff's useless, turn it off. Then you start turning on detections, and you're like, okay, let's back test some of these detections. Okay, this one's not too bad. Turn that on live. So you kind of have to filter through and work a little backwards maybe for a SIM. EDR is kind of the same thing. You do tuning periods. There's tools like PAMs that you can run in audit mode just to see what it looks like. So a lot of good tools have audit mode where you can say, hey, what would this look like if it were live, and you can make corrections. So if you have the capability to do things like in audit mode, sure, turn it on and go crazy. If you don't have that capability and you have to go live, just start really small, get the incremental wins, and just increment up over time. Otherwise, you're going to inundate your team and they're just not going to do it. It's a good question. What else?
The process that you described that everybody could have for onboarding them, is that something that you recommend sort of a micro scale, just like security, for instance, or the entire enterprise should follow?
Everybody.
I would assume it should be everybody.
So everybody, but we can only control what we can control, right? Like Simon Sinek is big on like, you have an area of control, area of influence. I can't tell our CFO how to pick their tool. Like I can make suggestions. I can't. We have a product dev person, I think, or a product manager back there. I think, like she can tell us that we don't live in a world where we get to dictate how people do stuff, probably. But having an effective control in our environment helps us, and that's what we can control. So I like to tell my team, I'm the end of the storm. Like I can't really stop the storm around us in our organization, but I can make me the last stop of that. And processes like this are one way to do that. So yeah, if your company doesn't have one, build one. Often you'll find that people around you are going to be like, why aren't your team less stressed? Why do fewer people quit from your team? And you're like, oh, I'm not a jerk. I have a process for this. And they're like, oh, I should have a process for this. And then they ignore it. But like by the 9th person who quits, they're like, what was that process again? It's like, how come you don't complain about your budget? It's like, oh, I'm not an idiot, so I just do it this way, right? Like you have those conversations. But yeah, if your company should have a process for onboarding tools universally, and from a security standpoint, you should be part of that process because you should be doing a security audit. That's part of the technical control side of it. If they don't, build one for your department, prove it works, and be like, hey, we've been doing this for a year. This has been really helpful for us. Maybe it'll be helpful in this production area. But definitely, yeah.
For example, security means asset management. Really, that's not like the operations. So I need to be able to bring the process here, influence and make sure that whatever they're doing, that's a good thing.
Really, who needs asset management is your financial department, right? So you kind of look, they do, trust me, they do, right? Like if they don't know what your assets are, they're problematic from an accounting perspective. So it's about understanding what the actual need of the organization is and trying to get your most bang out of the buck for it. I think a lot of times we look in isolation when we're talking about like defining the need. We think about it as like, what do I need out of this? And if you look at it from a, hey, what does the rest of the company actually need and where can we get benefit from this? Then you can kind of approach it that way, hopefully, and say, hey, we're looking at implementing an asset management tool because we need to know which of these servers exists. So when we're doing incident response, I know what we're responding to and what is there to respond to. IT, you need to know this stuff because if you don't, you're not patching it, and that makes my job harder, and I don't like that. So I'd like you to be part of this. You're like, finance department, do you guys already have an asset management tool? Like, are you guys buying Sage somewhere where we have a fixed asset management tool that maybe we can just leverage? And then you use their budget to buy your tool, and it's awesome. But mostly, you're just all in alignment. And now you're not trying to keep 3 different databases up to date because that'll be the next fight. You're like, hey, this says you have this server. They're like, we got rid of that 2 months ago. So you have to get on the same page with everybody about what the need of the organization is and approach it from there. Sometimes it doesn't work and you're out on your own and you get into fights over and over. But ultimately, like the ideal state is the organization has a tool that you all use for the same purpose or can sync data from. And that helps. Like vulnerability management is a big one, right? Like the IT department or the sysadmin group, whoever it is, divvies up, they'll have like an asset management tool so they understand who like data owners are, what the physical assets are, how they patch stuff. And then on the vuln side, you're like, did I get everything? And you're trying to figure that out, and it's really difficult. You just have to figure out, hopefully you can find the tool that you can import from theirs with, or you share the tools so they can do like check it, or you set up an audit schedule to get alignment. Yeah, ultimately, if you can get the same thing, you're in better shape. I like IT tools, so I usually say I can just provide an asset list to you folks if you want it, and I run it from my tool because then I get everything I want, and they deal with the CSV side of it and not the other way around. But also, usually security is in a better position to find all those assets than accounting or somebody else is. So you figure out like where in the environment or who is most suited to have that data and own it, and then everybody else kind of hopes that they do their job and that you make them the source of truth. Or budget. Yeah. And it's really hard because it's the same thing. Like when we talk about assets, we also mean people. And that means HR is like, should be the source of truth on who all the humans in your business are. Yeah. We got ADP back here. They're the source of truth for humans. So we go to them and we say, hey, and we do that with some of our customers, right? It's like, hey, this is how we populate these databases. We do go to ADP. We do export from ADP and say that is the source of truth for the organization. If a person comes in or exits the org, they are the one who knows. Ahead of the help desk, usually, for sure. So, like, you have to just figure out who can own that data realistically and hope they'll do it. I mean, sometimes it is just hope, right?
What is truth? When you have one data source says this, another data source says this, and then trying to get the delta of those together and find out what's true.
It is. It's a big challenge, and we see that like with tool sprawl. That's a big thing, right? Like if we're using a remote access tool in an EDR, they should be the exact same thing probably, but they almost never are, right? And if you then have a third patch management tool because you're using like Intune or something like that, you're like, okay, well, I'm a hybrid environment. AD says these are all the computers that exist. Intune says these are all the computers that exist. And my EDR says I have 300 extra devices that I'm paying for licensing for, but they're all checking in. What the hell is going on? But I only have 20 employees. Like these numbers don't usually fall all in line perfectly. As you scale, it gets a lot harder, but it's one of the things you have to do. And I think defining who is right, just this is the source of truth in the company, you have to be correct and everybody will fall in line to that. If you see a discrepancy, you say, hey, we found a discrepancy. We need you to sort this and tell us what is right, and then we'll adapt. And for computer assets, probably your IT department. For human assets, your HR department. If you're dealing with physical assets and that kind of security, facilities or whoever manages all that. But it's real. Like that is a challenge. Good questions. What else?
talked about onboarding the tools. What about onboarding the people? So you onboard somebody, 20 different tools, kick out all the emails day one, need access, and then maybe they get trained up on 5 and have lost access for like another 10, say log in within like 60 days.
Yeah.
So
How many of you have a documented training process to onboard new employees? How long is your training program?
It varies by department, so
For IT, like a week, a month?
it's pretty much, here's your access, did the stuff. Oh, we're gonna show you a little bit of time as we go through. It's like for the InfoSec team, like we have a breakdown of here's all the tools, here's who's gonna show, who's gonna train you how to use this one. It's not really across the entire organization, but IT and InfoSec are pretty good. But yeah, then there's there'll be like another group that has, this is the data team, and their portion. But it's not across the board.
Okay. How, I guess a better question, like, what is the ramp time for a new employee until you believe they're competent in their role? Like from the day you hire them to the day you're like, this person is fully onboarded, they know how to do their job, and as an organization, we derive value from them fully.
9 months, like we do instead of 30, 60, 90 days. It's 3 months, 6 months, 9 months.
Yeah. Like that's probably closer to accurate, but I think most people, our training plans are like a week, a month, maybe. And it's untenable. Like it's not a realistic goal because ultimately it does take 9 months to learn all this stuff. So you have to have plans that are realistic. I think what you're talking about is right, but you have to have repetitiveness in that. Like the idea that people don't remember things till the 7th time they're told. People don't remember things unless they action that item. So like the tendency is I need this person to learn all 20 tools because we have to be able to manage 20 tools and that means they'll be effective. Seems normal, but the reality is like kind of the tools themselves. If I can teach this person to do 5 things really well, they're going to come along faster, hate their job a lot less, and be more useful to you. Even if you can't give them all the work you can give them will be getting done better. So I think you have to look at training plans from that perspective and say like, what do I expect out of this person? Yes, in a year, I need them to be able to do all this stuff. But for the first 6 months, I really just need this out of them. And for the first week, I just need them to sit and listen. And I also don't want them to hate their job. So please don't just send them to video academies and say, watch these things. Like let them engage, let them shadow, let them click buttons.
6 months before,
Yeah.
New person is 80%.
Yeah.
At least, it's
I see that there were 200 days for like basic competency and then 2 years for
Yeah, that's probably about right. Like it takes a long time. It's 10,000 hours of intentional practice to be an expert at something. We hire based on people's ability to understand systems, not our systems, but like systems as a whole. No one comes into our companies knowing how we do business generally. So even if they're the best at the tool stack we use, they're not the best at how we use the tool stack or how it's implemented or knowing anybody else in the business that they'll need to help or leverage to get things done. So you can't hire a perfect person. It's impossible unless they worked there the day before and were really good and just left because, I don't know, for some reason and came right back. Like your training plan just has to account for that kind of stuff. And that's a challenge because everybody, by the time they're hiring, they're usually super busy and finally got the approval, right? So we're like, finally, I can offload some of this work, but you really can't. And that sucks, but it's same as anything else. You got to just plan for it and work through it and be intentional. Yeah, right. That's the other the side of that is like, okay, cool. I have a team of 5 and I'm going to go to 6. I should see a net increase in capacity now. Nope, I'm actually going to be slower because one of my 5 is now spending a full-time job training the person. And maybe by week 3, it's a part-time job training the person. But now all of a sudden, the thing that was supposed to help you definitely slows you down. And it just feels really, really obnoxious, but it's life. Good questions. I have no idea what time this is supposed to end, but any other questions?
2 minutes.
Cool. Nailed it. All right, well, thank you all. You guys have a great day.